Hello, adult Sunday school leader. Have you ever been on your way to do something important, something truly good, and suddenly you've been interrupted? Maybe you were helping someone in need and another need popped up, or you were having a meaningful conversation and someone else demanded your attention. We often see interruptions as distractions, but in God's hands, interruptions are often divine appointments. Now, in Luke chapter 8, Jesus is on his way to heal a dying girl. And he's interrupted by another desperate need, a woman who had been suffering for 12 long years. What looked like an interruption to us becomes an opportunity for Jesus to reveal his compassion, his power, and his perfect timing. This passage shows us that God's timing and compassion are never off schedule, even when life feels interrupted. That's what we're going to be looking at this week as we continue in that unit that's called How to Handle Life's Interruptions. This is lesson number 4, When Well-Meaning People Interrupt Your Plans. The focal passage is out of Luke chapter 8, and the point of this lesson is God-ordained interruptions call for a sensitive heart. Well, let's look at our first set of scriptures. It's going to be in Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 42. And the scene opens with Jesus returning from the region of the Gerasenes, where he had healed a man possessed by demons. Now, here in our passage, Jesus is returning to Capernaum, and he had a welcoming committee waiting for him because they were expecting him. Then we're introduced to Jairus. We only know a few things about him from these two verses. He was a synagogue leader. He had a 12-year-old daughter who was deathly ill, and he was desperate for her to be healed. You know, it's amazing what desperate people will do, isn't it? Sometimes desperation leads people to do things they never thought they could do or would do. Let's look at Jairus' desperation just for a little bit. He was a leader in the local synagogue. That meant he was an elder in charge of services and facilities. He lined up people to pray, read the scripture, and deliver the sermon. He cared for those sacred scrolls. He oversaw benevolence. The leader was usually a man of wealth and good reputation in the community. He was used to being in charge. For the most part, religious leaders weren't that fond of Jesus, were they? And we can't say for certain if Jairus originally felt any animosity against Jesus or not, but it wouldn't be out of the question to assume so. This man had wealth and religious status, so he was a man who was always in control of situations. But now he found himself in a predicament he had no control over. His little girl was dying. He abandoned all his pride and possible ridicule and not only approached Jesus, but fell at his feet. He just didn't invite Jesus to come to his home. He pleaded with him. So Jesus went with him toward Jairus' house. And the crowds were pressing in on him. You know, they were almost crushing him. And here we see something crucial about faith. Faith often begins where our ability ends. Jairus had likely exhausted every medical and spiritual option available to him, but now he comes to Jesus in humility and hope. Sometimes God allows us to reach the end of ourselves so we can finally reach out to him. There may be times when you face situations beyond your control, a sick child, a broken relationship, a job loss, or some personal fear. Like Jairus, you may not have all the answers, but you can bring your need to Jesus. He welcomes those who come in desperation and in faith. So just as Jesus is heading toward Jairus' house to handle interruption number 1, interruption number 2 comes on the scene. And that's where we continue in Luke 8, verses 43 through 48. Imagine Jairus watching in agony as Jesus paused to deal with this other situation. Every second must have felt precious to the synagogue leader. Yet, here's this woman, another sufferer, but a very different story. Now, the parallel account of this story is in Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34, and it gives a little bit more detail. She most likely had some type of uterine or menstrual disorder. Not only was this uncomfortable and probably painful, but she was in a constant state of ceremonial uncleanliness, just like Leviticus 15, 25 through 27 states. Her physical condition was compounded by the social and religious ramifications. Anyone who touched her, or those whom she touched, even their clothes, would be ceremonially unclean. Now here's Jim's opinion, okay? More than likely, she was not a native of Capernaum, because if she were, anyone who knew her would dare not get close to her, and she was right in the middle of this crowd. So even with the crowds almost crushing him, somehow this unnamed woman made her way to be near Jesus. Now the Mark 5 passage tells us that she spent everything she had on doctors with no results. And she thought that she could just touch his clothes and she would be healed. She was a desperate woman in a seemingly hopeless situation. She could have given up, and there's several excuses she could have used. Nothing's worked for her in 12 years. There are too many people here. I'll never get close enough to Jesus. Jesus is too busy to mess with someone like me. And the list goes on and on. But she didn't give up. She was defiled and desperate, but she was also determined. So why not just request an audience with Jesus like Jairus had done? Well, for one, she probably would be embarrassed to admit her situation there in public, and possibly she was afraid that Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, would scold her for mixing in the crowd in her condition. But somehow she was able to make her way through the crowd and get close enough to Jesus where she could reach out and touch the edge of his cloak. Now, in Bible times, the cloak was an outer garment. It was this wide vest with no sleeves, and it went from the down to the person's ankles. It's also called a robe or a mantle. She didn't have Jesus lay hands on her. She didn't have Jesus speak a word of healing over her. She just wanted to touch his cloak. And she thought if she could just do that, she'd be healed. And that's what happened. As soon as she touched the cloak of Jesus, she was immediately healed. The Mark 5 passage tells us that she felt the healing immediately take place in her body. And Jesus felt it too. He asked the question, "Who touched me?" Now, we might think this is an odd question for a couple of reasons. First, doesn't Jesus, the Son of God, know all? Of course he does, and he did. So I believe, of course, this wasn't a question of inquiry to obtain knowledge, but to make the woman identify herself. Kind of like it was in the Garden of Eden when God asked, "Where are you?" knowing full well where Adam and Eve were. If this woman with the bleeding issue had been allowed to slither away in the crowd, she wouldn't have received the verbal blessing from Jesus. Another reason this is an odd question is because there was a crowd pressing around him. Lots of people were touching him. Peter even told him that. Yes, there's a lot of people around him and pressing into him, but there was only one who was touching him in faith to be healed. And I wonder if it's not true in our churches. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of people who are pressing around Jesus. They're in proximity, getting a Jesus experience without really experiencing him. They might enjoy the music, the sermon, they might get a little spiritual lift on Sunday morning, but it really didn't change them. And that's really sad. Well, in verse 48, Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." And when we read that, we might picture something like a cell phone battery, draining when it's used too much. The more you use it, the weaker it gets until you have to plug it back in. But that's not what happened with Jesus. His power isn't limited or exhaustible. He didn't lose strength when that woman was healed. He released it intentionally. The power that went out from him wasn't drained away. It was divinely directed. Every time Jesus heals, forgives, or restores, he's not diminished. His glory, though, is displayed. The more he gives, the more he shows us that his strength has no limits. So the woman held out for as long as she could before identifying herself. She was trembling, and she publicly admitted why she was there and why she had reached out to touch Jesus. And then Jesus called the woman something that he's not recorded saying to anyone else in Scripture. He called her daughter. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. In one moment, she goes from being rejected and nameless to being accepted and known. Sometimes God's work in someone else's life may seem like an interruption to you, But Jesus is never too busy to stop for one hurting soul. What looks like a delay to us may be a divine appointment in his plan. If you ever feel unseen or unworthy, remember this: Jesus notices the one who reaches out in faith, even in the middle of a crowd. Think of an emergency room. Patients come in all at once, but the doctor triages. He knows who needs attention immediately. Jesus, the great physician, knows exactly when to pause and when to proceed. His timing may not match ours, but it's always perfect. Let's read the next set of verses, Luke 8:49 through 56. Now, the lesson book skips verses 51 through 53, but I'm going to cover them anyway. So just as Jesus was talking to the woman, someone came from Jairus' house with another interruption to tell Jairus that his daughter had died. And now there was no need for Jesus to come to the house. You know that Jairus had to think, if Jesus hadn't stopped and had this exchange with this unclean woman, then his little girl might still be alive. Because, what can be done after a person dies? That's the end, isn't it? No one in recent times had been brought back to life, had they? That's very similar to the story of Lazarus's first death, recorded in John 11, verses 1 through 43. Jesus was told that Lazarus was very ill, but Jesus waited 2 days before going to Bethany, where Lazarus was already dead and buried. And when Martha saw Jesus approaching their home, she said that if Jesus had been there earlier, her brother Lazarus wouldn't have died. But Jesus raised him from the dead. That wasn't the end for Lazarus. But Lazarus' rising from the dead occurred after this story that we're looking at today. And in the previous chapter, in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 16, Jesus raised a widow's son from the dead in the town of Nain. That was about 20 miles away from Capernaum, and it appears that this was the first recorded instance of Jesus raising someone from the dead. Luke 7:17 says that the news about Jesus spread throughout the land. But we're not really sure if that news had reached Capernaum or had reached Jairus yet. Jesus heard the report of the 12-year-old girl's death, but he wasn't discouraged by it. Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed. Now, Jesus didn't deny the tragedy. He calls Jairus to hold on to faith, even in the face of death. The timing may have seemed a little off to Jairus, but Jesus' power transcends time and circumstance. He arrived at Jairus' house and only allowed his inner 3 disciples, Jairus, and we'll call her Mrs. Jairus, to go in. Jesus told the mourners to stop because she was only sleeping. Now, what was their response to that? They laughed. Sleeping? No way. She was dead. She was alive a little bit ago, but she was definitely dead now. This rabbi, this traveling preacher, obviously didn't know the difference between sleep and death. What a bumpkin. But guess what? Jesus used that same terminology in the passage on Lazarus' death, as we look in John 11 through 13. And so Jesus takes that little girl by the hand, and as Mark 5:41 records, Jesus said the Aramaic phrase, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. Verse 55 in our passage states that her spirit returned, indicating that she was indeed dead. And then to prove that she wasn't just revived, but healed, Jesus ordered that she be given something to eat. This would not only provide nourishment to the child, but would also show the doubters that she was indeed restored to her pre-illness condition. With just a touch and a word, her life returned. The interruption that seemed like a delay had become the stage for a greater miracle. And then Jesus told the parents not to tell anyone what had happened. Just a few verses back in Luke 8:39, he told the man delivered from a legion of demons to go and share what God had done for him. But here he demanded the parents not tell. Why is that? Why allow one person to tell about the miraculous thing that happened and tell another to keep quiet? Here's the thing. We can speculate, but honestly, we don't know. I believe each case was unique, and Jesus knew where it was okay for this information to spread and where it would be dangerous or detrimental to his ministry. Also, in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45, it tells the story of Jesus healing a man with leprosy. And he then gave the healed man a strict warning not to tell anyone. And verse 45 says this, "Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere." Yes, Jesus performed many miracles. He healed lots of people. But that was a secondary reason for his coming to earth. His primary mission was to preach the good news of forgiveness, of redemption and salvation. When folks heard about Jesus' miracles, of course they came from all over to be touched and healed by the Master. I know I would be there. So what does this lesson mean for us? What can we take away from this story of interruptions? Well, first of all, when you feel God has delayed too long, when your prayer hasn't been answered, and hope seems gone, remember that Jesus is never late. His delays are not denials. They are divine opportunities for greater faith. God is never early. He's never late. He is always exactly on time, but his clock runs differently than ours. Faith is trusting in his timing, even when we don't understand his pace. Also, this passage teaches us some lessons when we are the ones being interrupted, when we have so many other things to do. First is to see people, not interruptions. When people interrupt your plans, stop long enough to look at them the way Jesus did, as people, not problems. You may discover that God has placed them in your path for a reason. Also, allow yourself to be interruptible if you want to be usable. You can practically do this by building some margin into your day so that interruptions don't derail you, but instead become ministry moments for you. Also, let compassion guide your response, not convenience. When someone interrupts you, compassion is more important than efficiency. People are always more valuable than your agenda. And finally, one that I think many of us need to hear and apply is this: don't confuse busyness with faithfulness. Being constantly busy isn't the same as being faithful. Sometimes faithfulness means stopping in the middle of a task to meet an unexpected need. Next week, we're going to continue in the unit on interruptions by looking at what to do when a time of inactivity slows you down. We're going to be looking in Acts chapter 1 and chapter 2. All right. There again, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate your emails, your encouragement, your comments. But don't forget, pray for and with your class. She most likely had some type of uterine or menstrual disorder. So this was not only discomfort. So she most likely had some kind of uterine or menstrual disorder. Not only was this uncomfortable and probably painful, but she was in a constant state of ceremonially